The Vanity Project, Episode 5, The 11th Hour. When I learned Richard had set out to destroy his own work, I was stunned. His story of loading the canisters that contain the original film negative of Williamstown into his garbage was heartbreaking. No film should ever be lost. After I flew home from seeing him, I realized I had to regroup and figure just what the next step would be. But I was stuck on the question of why someone would do this, spend all this time and money to make something that they truly believed in, and turn around and destroy it. In my effort to understand this, I got in touch with an expert on obscure American films, Joe Rubin, a co-founder of the home video label Vinegar Syndrome. And what Joe told me blew my mind. Richard was not alone in destroying his own work. In fact, there was a whole world of these movies abandoned by their creators. Joe has spent years rescuing, restoring, and preserving all sorts of movies. But what I learned was he has a special place in his heart for the movies that fall under the umbrella term of vanity projects. Okay, so I should note, I've just spoken aloud the title of our podcast. What is a vanity project? It's typically defined as a creative endeavor that's flattering to the person who made it. A movie, a book, an album. It could even be a business that's there to serve the creator's ego, something made as a tool for self-promotion, for their own recognition. Aside from Student Confidential, I was vaguely familiar with the existence of other vanity project films. I, of course, knew the movie The Room. That film became famous after its creator, Tommy Wiseau, relentlessly promoted it in Los Angeles, and one of its actors wrote a pretty great book about the making of it, and it all got turned into a mainstream Hollywood movie with some big stars. After showing Joe that crap VHS copy of Richard's movie, he emailed me an incredible list of dozens of films, some of which he had actually rescued, that also fit this category. Movies like Red Midnight, a nuclear scare movie which was made by a Cape Cod optometrist in the 1960s. Hollywood Horror House, an early 70s thriller that was shot over several years by a tour bus owner that featured one of the Three Stooges in the cast. And from the 1980s, Knee Dancing, a movie made by a woman living in a polygamous marriage in a castle in the California desert, all about exploring her childhood traumas. All of these movies made by people who had never written, produced, directed, or starred in a movie before. Some of these filmmakers had abandoned their film materials at the lab where they were eventually thrown out. Another had left everything on their porch to bake in the sun for decades. And just like Richard, some had even destroyed the negatives with their own hand. I got on the phone with Joe to talk more about these kinds of films and about how Richard's movie fit into all of this.
Like Student Confidential was written, produced, directed, edited. The music was composed and performed by, and then it was, starring the same guy. What other movies have you come across that sort of fit this profile?
The one which most immediately comes to mind is Champagne and Bullets. And I think, the two films are actually very similar. So this film was made in the early 90s by a successful injury lawyer in Riverside, California. And again, very similarly to Student Confidential, he wrote, directed, produced, composed the music, performed the music, and stars as the romantic lead. He got some Hollywood B players like Wings Hauser and William Smith to show up, and in the case of Hauser, show up very drunk. And again, this being a director, writer, star about a clearly personal subject, treated in a dead serious way. Like it feels like it couldn't be anything but a personal reflection of something that meant a great deal to the director.
What else would drive someone to go this far? Like, if someone wanted to make a buck, there's a million examples of genre films that are unique and some of them totally awesome, but they were clearly made because they had the market for, the drive-in in mind, or the home video market or whatever. But these sorts of films that we're talking about, when someone takes on all these jobs and they do not have any background in film, it feels like what must be driving them is a creative impulse to express something that they feel needs to be expressed.
You actually just reminded me of two other examples that are relevant. So the first is After Last Season, which I know we talked about at one point.
Yeah. I have never seen After Last Season. Have you? And what's the story with that movie?
I have seen it. I think I've seen it twice, actually. I pretty much know nothing about the guy who made it, other than he had zero background as a filmmaker. He has not made a single film since. It's a science fiction murder mystery that sort of involves time travel, maybe. With so many of these films, the plot is not why it's interesting. After Last Season feels like something made by someone who doesn't live on this planet.
Right.
It's shot mostly in barren rooms that are like supposed to be other than barren rooms. Like things will be drawn or sketched on pieces of paper on the wall, and therefore that's supposed to be like an actual object. There's very famously a cardboard MRI machine uh, that is supposed to be a real MRI machine. It's one of the most indescribably strange experiences that I've ever had watching a movie of this type. That is another example that, just like Richard, the guy, after it was a failure, threw away everything because he was disappointed with it. And in this case, he truly did throw away everything. He threw away the negative, apparently. He threw away all the other prints because he was self-distributing it. And he just determined that, he had tried, he had failed, he had to move on. And that is just such a bizarre concept to me as well. For someone to throw away their art and basically say, like, the audience response was not what I was hoping for, therefore no one should ever be able to experience it again.
A vanity project is usually seen as something made to fuel the creator's ego. But I had a hard time seeing Richard's film as fitting that definition. In Student Confidential and in Williamstown, Richard had cast himself as someone broken. Both characters he wrote for himself are profoundly lonely, people longing for human contact. In Student Confidential, the film's final shots feature Richard literally crying, humbled by the people he thought he was helping. And Williamstown is about his character reckoning with the fact that he can never grasp what he yearns for: love, in the form of the ghostly love of his life, Sarah. Once you scratch the surface on Richard's films, you get what Michael Weldon had pegged back in his 1990 review of Student Confidential in Psychotronic Video magazine, that this had to be an autobiographical work. When I met Richard in person, I asked him about this feeling he lent to his characters that he seemed to identify with, this feeling of always being on the other side of experience. How do you feel that you're different than other people?
Oh, wow. Depression is one thing. That's a major thing, if I'm being honest. Clinical depression. Depressed all the time. Pretty much. Everything is mechanical. Everything is mechanical. I do not have spontaneous responses. Do not. I think everything through before it comes out of my mouth. I long for the time when I can, laugh uproariously at something that is or is not funny. I have to figure it out first before I think that it's funny. Once in a blue moon, I'll let out a little chuckle. But usually everything is calculated. All actions are calculated, all emotions are calculated, all thoughts are calculated. There's not anything spontaneous in me, pretty much. Except for what happens with these crazy ideas of inventions. And I love that. That to me is my only joy, is to sit here doing nothing, and all of a sudden an idea comes into my head that was not there before, a new idea. All of a sudden I invent something.
Would you consider your films also inventions?
Yes, absolutely.
The creators of vanity projects are talked about by academics and historians as outliers, crackpots, not to be taken seriously in the world of the mainstream. But I wonder if part of the reason for this is that their work holds an uncomfortable truth. In their drive to go to these lengths to express themselves, they reveal something universal, the need for approval. I know from experience that there's a desire for approval bundled up inside the work I do. Of the movies I've done, I'm lucky that each of them has made some kind of small financial profit. For this reason, I'm considered a mild success, at least to a half dozen accountants at a few different film companies around Los Angeles. But if I'm being honest, there was another reason I was making these movies. To gain the approval of those faceless people I imagined sitting in a theater, or the ones rating my movie on IMDb, or writing about my films on social media. Because to gain their approval meant that what I cared about, my feelings, were worth something. And isn't that what anyone would want? There are plenty of well-known directors who began their careers by making small, personal films, hungry to make their mark on the cinema when no one else had faith in them. In fact, some of the most famous examples were my biggest inspirations as a teenager: John Waters, Jim Jarmusch, and David Lynch. But of course, in every one of those cases, they made their early do-it-yourself films where they did 10 jobs to eventually break into the system. And they succeeded. In many ways, Richard is just like those guys. He didn't want to make films in obscurity. He wanted to reach people. And for someone prone to always feeling different from everyone else, the rejection of his movies by critics and audiences was a wound he felt he could never recover from. Richard's films were inventions to reach people, and in doing so, gain approval. But the inventions didn't work. By his own logic, it makes a kind of sense to just throw them out. Richard's film Williamstown was surely lost. He had destroyed it, as he told the story, placing the prints and then the canisters with the negatives week by week into his garbage. By my research, those elements for Williamstown, this movie Richard had spent nearly $1 million on, are buried inside the El Sobrante landfill in Corona, California. But the movie that had started me on this journey was Student Confidential. And Richard's story of the film had ended with him sending a letter to Troma instructing them to destroy the movie. Now, I knew Troma owned the license on a whole lot of films. From the 1980s on, they had begun steadily vacuuming up all sorts of obscure movies, putting some of them in theaters and then on VHS and DVD and later streaming. If you scroll through their website, you'll see they own hundreds upon hundreds of titles. Troma, I thought, must literally have warehouses filled with prints, negatives, and video masters. So was Student Confidential really lost? Had they really taken the time to throw out the film because of Richard's request? Or sadder still, at some point, had they just maybe thrown it out to make space? Over the years, I had gotten to know David Gregory, the co-owner of Severin Films, one of the best boutique home video labels in the world. David has dedicated much of the last 25 years of his life to hunting down elements for the most obscure movies around. Severin has released some of the most famous cult films of all time, including movies by Russ Meyer and Dario Argento, but they specialize in deep cuts. Just look at their deluxe box set of 21 Black Emanuelle films. Yes, that's 21 movies. I asked David if he could talk to the other head of Troma, Michael Hertz, to see if by chance they had any film materials for Student Confidential. A week later, David called me to say he'd spoken to Michael, and that when he asked if they had any film material for Student Confidential, Michael had replied by saying this, quote,
I made a promise to Richard Horian. I cannot answer that question until I have been released from that promise.
When David asked him what the promise was, Michael refused to answer. I made a promise to Richard Horian. The implication here was that Troma did not destroy Student Confidential. When David pressed Michael if this was the case, Michael communicated that to search for any elements they might still have, he would need to first talk to Richard to get his permission. So I knew I had to call Richard, and this was going to be a delicate call. I was essentially going to have to say to him, hey, you know those guys who distributed that movie you made? You know, the movie which personally hurt you when it was released? Those guys who, when they released the movie on DVD in a crap VHS transfer, went out of their way to make fun of your movie? Yeah, those guys. Would you talk to them again? When I did finally talk to Richard, his answer was that no, he would not. And Richard also didn't understand how bringing Student Confidential back would be beneficial to anyone. I reminded him I thought it must be if I had spent something like 37 years of my life thinking about it. So he mulled it over and told me he'd think about it. And then, some days later, I got an email from Richard asking to schedule a time to get on the phone because he was excited to pitch to me the future of Student Confidential. When we got on the phone, Richard announced that he had reconsidered maybe there was a way to bring back the movie. But he had surveyed the current market carefully, and he felt the only way for the film to get back into the world and be noticed was that it would have to be presented in a new, exciting way that would appeal to today's audiences. Richard thought the film should be remade using Avatar-style animation. Richard told me his movie should be transformed to look like the film Beowulf. Beowulf is a computer-animated film from 2007 that was made for $150 million. Beowulf was so expensive, by the way, that even though it apparently earned almost $200 million worldwide, it was considered a flop because it was so expensive. Avatar, Richard's other reference, of course, was a hit, at a mere investment of $237 million to produce. When I brought these facts up, Richard excitedly explained that technology had come far since those movies were made, and his research showed that we could simply use the VHS copies that existed of Student Confidential and feed them into a $299 app he had seen on YouTube that apparently transformed your home videos into Japanese anime-style digital cartoons. The soundtrack was fine, he said. It could stay just the same. So, he concluded, there'd be no need to locate the original film elements. I stood on my porch listening to Richard's pitch. Now, it's important to remember here, there's a reason Richard is a successful businessman. He had, in fact, surveyed the market and put his finger on exactly the sort of brand new technology that was transforming Hollywood. Even if those tools, by the way, were destroying the industry I was trying to make a living in. It wasn't really a bad idea. It was just not what I had in mind. So, I took several deep breaths, and then I countered, saying, I indeed could help make the Avatar version of Student Confidential, if this is what he wanted. In exchange for him to consent for me to search for the original film materials and see if they existed. I told him his new digital cartoon version of Student Confidential would be like the new Star Wars movies, and the original, if I could preserve it, would be like the old one. Richard seemed to like that I was negotiating, and he agreed. I wrote up a contract asking for permission to search for his film. I had struck a deal with Michael Drake. Because of that deal, Richard finally agreed to email with Michael Hertz. But soon after that, Michael surprised Richard with a phone call. The two hadn't spoken in decades, and apparently after they reminisced about when they worked together, Richard gave Michael the go-ahead to look in the multiple warehouses Troma stored film elements in to see if they could find anything. I was elated. But then, one day as I was driving, Michael Hertz called me. He said they had had zero luck finding anything. Michael sounded quite sad about this, saying that he knew the film was special in its own way, and he wasn't totally giving up hope. They would keep looking, but the prospects seemed grim. I could feel my heart breaking. Maybe, after 37 years, this was all a long goodbye. The summer of 2024 was a long one. While the Hollywood strikes had ended the previous year, the industry that emerged in its wake was changed. It was smaller, tougher to get a job. Most of my filmmaker friends were out of work, and my efforts to save Richard's film had stalled out. But then on July 1st, I was included on an email sent from Michael Hertz to Richard.
Dear Richard, we have recovered several boxes of materials which seem to contain original negative and optical tracks. We'd be happy to ship them, pursuant to your instructions. Please confirm. We truly hope these materials will be adequate to preserve the legacy. Regards, M.H.
I was overjoyed. I told Richard I would draw up a simple contract that would allow his film elements to be shipped to LA so they could be inspected by Joe Rubin to see if they were fit to be preserved and scanned to eventually get the film released again. I knew Richard, ever the businessman, would want assurance that everything was above board and in his best interest. But after I sent Richard the agreement, I got this email reply back. Again, here's an actor reading Richard's email to me.
If I didn't think you were one of the true descendants of the original Saint Nick, I would have to classify this as the largest pile of malevolent bullshit I have ever seen in my life. Why? This contract only accomplishes one thing. It gets the film out of my hands and into yours. Now that you have full possession of my film, the bloodletting starts, step by step, in excruciating detail, with me having no control. A full-time job with no reward. Who is going to fix the film, and precisely, technically, how? Who is going to pay for any and all restoration? Your contract doesn't even say if there will be any attempt to market the film, and if so, under what terms? There isn't enough paper. What you did is ask someone to give you the title to their bought and paid for $1 million house, and they'll put it in a warehouse for storage, and it will have no practical use. I really appreciate your exuberant sincerity, but I question your complete lack of detail. You ask for much. You give somewhat less than little. Sorry, Nick. You did not intentionally intend to mislead. You sent a quick but lacking contract to get the ball rolling, but it was a lead balloon.
Here, at my moment of truth, I had made an enemy. I immediately called Richard, telling him that the contract I had drawn up was simply an agreement to transport his property so that it could be safely inspected. As I explained to him I was not out to get him, I was acutely aware that at the other end of the phone was Michael Drake, the counselor, the man who did not suffer fools wisely, the man who made millions from the ideas in his head. I was in perhaps the single weirdest moment of my life. The man who I had watched on screen when I was 17 was now after me, accusing me of betraying him, of trying to rip him off, of being just like all the others. Despite my pleading, Richard emailed Troma asking everything to be sent to him. It was as if this journey I was on, every time I came to what I thought might be the end, a new road kept appearing. I asked Richard to please not touch what was in the boxes, open them, take pictures, but for the love of Mike, don't handle what was in there. And for God's sake, I told him, don't throw them out. Don't throw them out. A week later, another email came through from Michael Hertz. This one read,
Dear Richard, The cost of shipping 5 boxes, UPS ground, will be approximately $500. If you have a better, cheaper way, please let us know.
Almost instantly, I got an email from Richard.
Nicholas, would you take care of this?
A few hours later, I did, having everything sent to me with Richard's consent. On the morning of July 17th, 2024, UPS dropped off 5 heavy boxes at my friend Jim's office. Joe Rubin came by to see what was inside them.
What about this box?
It's probably going to be a tracking egg. Or
As it turned out, they contained all the original film elements for Student Confidential. The original negative, the original separated sound elements, things like trailers, a TV spot, everything crucial to preserving the film in immaculate shape.
well, I can scan for it if you want.
You can hear right there when Joe offered to digitally scan the material in 4K. He also told me where I could drop the audio reels off that day to have the soundtrack transferred. After we packed everything back up, I took Joe and Jim out to lunch to thank them. While waiting for our food, I went outside to call Richard and tell him the good news. "We did it," I said. And Richard replied, "No, you did it. This was about you." And of course, he was right. Richard Horian had wanted Student Confidential never seen again. And against his wishes, I had pushed and prodded and charmed him to save this movie from being forgotten. If it wasn't for all my efforts, Richard's film very likely would have been consigned to oblivion. I felt like I had done something good here. I felt like I had saved this film at the 11th hour. It seemed like time had been running out, and if I didn't step up, who would? What I didn't know, standing there in the parking lot of the Good Neighbor Diner in Los Angeles with Richard on the other end of the phone, was that time was actually running out. Next time on The Vanity Project, to quote the first credit in the end crawl of Student Confidential, the end. The Vanity Project is a production of Topic Studios, presented by SpectraVision Radio, and made in association with Severin Films. It was created and narrated by me, Nicholas McCarthy, produced by Nicholas McCarthy with Graham Resnick, edited and mixed by Graham Resnick. The video editing for our episodes was done by Zena Gray. Special thanks to Joe Rubin, David Gregory, and Jim Kuntz. Also thanks to Michael Hertz for not keeping his promise to destroy Richard's movie. The voice of Richard Horian's emails were read by Paul Gaeta, whose favorite movie, I should mention, is called Man-Eater of Hydra. The music you've been hearing was composed and performed by Richard Horian, written and recorded for his film, Student Confidential. Stay tuned.